The world is a system of interrelated components, none of which can survive without each other. There are two great currents which have thoroughly molded the culture of China, and they are Taoism and Confucianism. And they play a curious game with each other. Let me start by saying something about Confucianism. Confucianism is not a religion. It's a social ritual and a way of ordering society, and involves ideas of human relations, including the government and the family, based on the principle of human-heartedness. That's the nearest we can get to it in English. And it was regarded by Confucius as the highest of all virtues, but one that he always refused to define. It's above righteousness and justice and propriety and other great Confucian virtues. And it involves the principle that human nature is a fundamentally good arrangement, including not only our virtuous side, but also our passionate side, also our appetites and our waywardness. And so a truly human-hearted person is a gentleman with a slight touch of rascality, just as one has to have salt in a stew. The world is a system of interrelated components, and to try to be wholly righteous is to go beyond humanity, to try to be something that isn't human. Confucianism has been one of the most successful philosophies in all history for the regulation of governmental and family relationships. But of course, it is concerned with formality. Confucianism prescribes all kinds of formal relationships, linguistic, ceremonial, musical, in etiquette, in all the spheres of morals. First of all, I'm going to talk about ideas which come strictly out of Lao Tzu's book, the Tao Te Ching. And the book of Lao Tzu starts out by saying that the Tao which can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Because the word Tao means both the way or course of nature or of everything. It also means to speak. The actual opening phrase of the book, the way which can be spoken, described, uttered. But it also means the way that can be weighed. W-A-Y-E-D, you'd have to invent that word. The way that can be traveled, perhaps, is not the eternal way. In other words, I can't give you any do-it-yourself instructions, but we can gather what it is by absorbing certain atmospheres and attitudes connected with those who follow it. And from the art and the poetry and all the expressions and the anecdotes and stories. Now, if you look up a Chinese translation of the Bible, it says in the beginning was the Tao. And the Tao was with God, and the Tao was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by it, and without it was not anything made that was made. The book, the Tao Te Ching, is written for many purposes, but one of its important purposes is as a manual of guidance for a ruler. And what it tells him is essentially, rule by not ruling. Don't lord it over the people. And so he says the great Tao flows everywhere, both to the left and to the right. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. And when good things are accomplished, it lays no claim to them. The Tao, having done anything, always escapes and is not around to receive any thanks or acknowledgement because it loves obscurity. And Lao Tzu said the Tao is like water. It always seeks the low level which human beings abhor. So it's a very mysterious idea. The Tao is not something different from nature, from ourselves, from our surrounding trees and waters and air. The Tao is the way all that behaves. And so the basic Chinese idea of the universe is really that it's an organism. Everything operating together so that nowhere can you find the controlling center. The world is a system of interrelated components, none of which can survive without each other. Just as in the case of bees and flowers, you will never find bees around in a place where there aren't flowers, and you will never find flowers around in a place where there aren't bees or insects that do the equivalent job. And what that tells us secretly is that although bees and flowers look different from each other, they're inseparable. They, to use a very important Taoist expression, they arise mutually. This is one of the great phrases from the second chapter of Lao Tzu's book, where he says, "To be and not to be mutually arise." You could say positive and negative, to be and not to be, yes and no. Light and dark arise mutually, come into being. So as the bees and the flowers coexist in the same way as high and low, back and front, long and short, loud and soft, all those experiences are experienceable only in terms of their polar experience. All the various species arise mutually because they interdepend. And this total system of interdependence is the Tao. This mutual arising is the key idea. It is the most important thing to grasp. Because you see, we think so much in terms of cause and effect. We think of the universe in Aristotelian and Newtonian ways. And in that philosophy, the world is all separated. But of course, from the standpoint of 20th century science, we know perfectly well now that that's not the way it works. We know enough about relationships to see that that mechanical model which Newton devised was all right for certain purposes. But it breaks down now because we understand relativity and we see how things go together in a kind of connected net. In the philosophy of the Tao, it's always being said, you read this in every art book about Chinese art, that in Chinese painting, man is always seen as in nature rather than dominating it. You get a painting entitled "Poet Drinking by Moonlight," and you see a great landscape, and after some search with a magnifying glass, at last you see the poet. The Taoist-inspired painters, the Zen-inspired painters, have this view of man as an integral part of nature, something in it just as everything else is in it, flowers and birds, and not there sent into this world, commissioned by some sort of supernatural being to come into this world and farm it and dominate it.